When you watch how elk behave in the wild, if there's a bull approaching a herd,
when I was trying to figure this whole game out a long time ago, I used to document every single elk encounter I had.
I just think people overcall all the time. And I do it too. Welcome to the Built to Hunt podcast, brought to you by the team of hunt advisors at the Huntin Fool magazine, where we are dedicated to helping our members go on more hunts with better information. Join Huntin Fool today at huntinfool.com.
This podcast is brought to you by onX Hunt. Get the onX Hunt Elite membership and give yourself every advantage you can this hunting season without breaking the bank. The onX Elite membership has all the maps and data for all 50 states, plus Canada. It works with or without your cell coverage, and it has the GPS tools you'll need to know where you are and where you're going when out in the field. It also provides you with exclusive services and discounts for everything you need on your hunt, from boots all the way to suppressors. You can save even more money this hunting season when you use code HUNTINFOOL to receive 20% off your first premium or elite membership at www.onxmaps.com/hunt.
Eric Batchoffner here with another Built to Hunt podcast. And on today's podcast, we're going to be talking about my absolute favorite type of hunting, elk hunting in the rut. I'm joined today by fellow elk enthusiasts and hunt advisors Jerrod Lyle and 𝗙cie_𝗹𝗹𝘀. Welcome, guys.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank
We're
you.
excited to be here. We like that topic too. I just hope that I can do it like Utah does it with guns in the rut.
There you go.
Or like a gov tag.
You guys got your September countdown started yet?
Oh, yeah.
It is, isn't it?
Sneaking up on us.
No, it's not sneaking. It's rushing up on us. It's coming on as aggressive as you need to be to hunt archery elk during the rut, Eric.
There it is. Exactly right. Yep.
I'm getting my sight and tape stickered onto my bow here this week, so we're ready to go.
Good. Well, let's start out today by talking a little bit about locating bulls during the peak of the rut. Well, first off, let's talk about what part of September we're referring to when we're talking about the peak of the rut. What would you guys say is, if you had to pick a range of, say, 5 or 6 days to hunt, what would you say those days would be?
Isaiah?
That's kind of a difficult one. I mean, I've hunted a fair amount of the states out west for elk or guided, and it really, I don't know, seems to vary a little, I guess. But I always feel like if I'm out in the field around September 20th, it doesn't matter where you're at, you are going to get some bulls that are going to pipe off. I know some states early on it can be hit or miss, and as you roll into October, it can be hit or miss, but I feel like across the board, you're pretty safe around September 20th.
Yeah, I would say probably the 17th to the 22nd would be that magic window, so right in there too. I think the other thing is like defining peak of the rut, because I think we define it as like, is there a frenzy going on, right? How frenzied is the bugling and all of the vocalizations? And the reality is, like Isaiah was alluding to, sometimes it basically depends on when a cow is coming into estrus, or if she is in estrus. That tends to make it feel like you're in the peak of the rut, and that can happen on the 7th of September some days, and it can happen on the 20th of October. So I would define it more around like it's kind of localized. Like if you get lucky enough to be in a valley that has a hot cow or 10 of them, then things get crazy and fun.
No, definitely. I've been in areas where I thought I was in the peak of the rut one day, and the next day it was a ghost town.
Yep. Same.
What about you? I know you get to poke around in some special units in Montana out there. What do you see?
I'd say from my experience, probably the 15th through the 20th has been when I've gotten into most of my, at least, vocalization activity. And then there tends to be typically a lull right towards the end of September before that second estrus comes in, and then a couple days early October where it picks back up pretty heavy. But yeah, I mean, if I was trying to plan a trip, a couple months out, and I had to lock down some dates to try and hedge my bets on hitting, the peak of the rut. Sometime 15th through the 20th, I think, is your safest bet.
Yeah, and I would say too, I mean, it depends on your style of hunting and whether you want to call bulls in or do more of a spot and stock approach. hitting the peak of the rut isn't always necessarily going to be your best option either. So,
Right.
Depends on if you're the guy that, a lot of people or first-time hunters want to be in all the action. But I know for me, doing a lot of hunts where I'm more spot and stock style and not calling, I necessarily don't want to be where there's too much activity going on all at once. So,
No, I think that's probably primarily because too much activity. Elk are vocal animal. You can hear them from well over a mile or 2 miles on the right conditions. It tends to attract all of your buddies too, all of your favorite hunting buddies. And so, I tend to shy away. Like my public land elk hunts in really highly, with tag where there's high tag numbers, I tend to not like that window quite as much from a success point of view, but from having a good time and hearing a lot of elk, I do love being out all through the month of September.
So let's talk a little bit more about locating bulls during the peak of the rut. When they're really going off and they're all wound up, how are you changing your location strategies compared to, say, pre-rut or post-rut scenarios?
Well, I think pre-rut and post-rut, for me, I rely on glass a ton. I would rather be on a knob somewhere that has miles and miles of visibility to a bunch of different key areas than to necessarily be where I'm close enough that I can hear a bull and move in on him right away. Whereas you start getting closer to that peak of the rut, I don't mind hunting more with my ears than with my eyes. So I would say that changes a little bit for me. I think as far as locating, elk get vocal, in my experience in, early August, they'll start bugling a little bit and sounding off. The hormones are running through their bodies. Their antlers are hardening up. They're rubbing it off. They're making wallows, and they can't help themselves. They'll sound off a little bit. So I'm always looking to hear bulls as a primary way of location, but definitely during the peak of the rut, I rely on my ears more than any other time of the year.
Yep. And I think a lot of it, again, comes down to where you're hunting, the pressure it's receiving, the terrain, whether it's thick timber or open flats. I mean, I know that's a big part of why I quit hunting northwest Montana where I grew up, is because you cannot see elk. You can hear them, and that's about it. So if you're having a stretch of time where bulls aren't bugling, it's super frustrating. I mean, you can be into elk every day and they're there. They're in that pocket. Like you
can smell them.
Yeah, you might have sounded off a locator bugle early in the morning and had a bull piping off. But then when they decide, I'm not going to play today, like it's the most frustrating thing ever. So that's where I started, Jerrod encouraged me to start looking at other parts of the state where I could actually glass elk and at least feel like you're in the game.
Yep. I mean, that's the other side of it too, right? Like in the peak of the rut, early on, even some big mature bulls may be solo. They might be kind of cruising around. But if you are talking about those peak rut days, you just have more chances to see because there's more animals, period. So if they're kind of moving in and out of timber pockets and feeding on the edges of little meadows and things and ridge tops, if you find a group of 8 to 40 cows, there is going to be a bull or 10 there.
Sure. Absolutely.
So it makes it a little easier even on the glassing side. I do think one thing that's important to note, and we talk about this all the time, almost every podcast talks about it, but elk are so stinking nomadic that I think that's one of the parts that makes them the most hard to hunt any time of the year. I think they're at least as nomadic during the peak of the rut as they ever are, and maybe the most nomadic they are, period. And I don't know if it's because a lot of the areas I hunt have a lot of predators, mountain lions, grizzly bears, wolves, etc., but maybe they feel the obligation, since they've been yelling all day about where they're at, to move further those times of years. But man, elk can move a long ways in the peak of the rut. And so when it comes to strategies to locate them, you also have to cover a ton of country, in my opinion. If you're not on them, you just got to cover more ground, whether that be in a vehicle, on foot, with glass, with your ears. you just got to cover a ton of ground.
Yep.
They're super nomadic.
No, I would agree with that. And I mean, same thing, when it's peak of the rut for me, and like you guys, I spent a lot of time hunting Northwest Montana, thick timber. Glassing isn't a thing. I mean, there was a time I didn't even hunt with binocs, 'cause you just didn't need them. But no, when the middle of September starts rolling around, my hunts change pretty drastically as far as my strategies going and trying to pick up some elk. Earlier in the season, I'm a lot more patient with, responses and the time it's going to take sometimes for these bulls to come in. Once the middle of September is here, I'm running and gunning. I mean, I am running ridges, covering as much ground as possible. I'll give it a minute or two after a bugle, and if I don't get a response, I'm off to the next basin. In conjunction with that too, I'm not a primetime first light, last light hunter anymore either. I'm hunting all day long because those bulls will, they can't help themselves and they'll answer you in the middle of the day oftentimes. And no, I think that's the best way to hunt that time of year is to really be getting after it and hunting hard all day long.
Yeah, I found too when I was guiding a lot and even some personal hunting that, a majority of the bulls that I actually called in for people, it was during midday. And it just seemed like those elk, you weren't playing catch up, as they were moving from feeding to bedding. The cows weren't on their feet. It was just like almost as if they kind of settle down. That bull feels a little more secure as you slip in there and then start calling, and it kind of pulls him off his feet. But man, I've had a heck of a time calling bulls in the morning, whereas more into the afternoon and evening, I've had better luck getting them to respond and come into my call.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and going back to the middle of the day there, I think I've had a lot of experiences with, putting a herd to bed, and basically forcing the hand on a herd bull because, and it's a high risk, high reward play too, right? Because I mean, if you're going after a herd bull in their bedding area and it doesn't go right for you, you're probably not going to find that bull again. But
you better hope you have a couple bottles of water with you, because you're going to play catch up for quite a while.
But I mean, the good news is a herd bull is not typically going to be able to hook his cows and get them to push off. So if you got the wind right and you sneak in and you can kind of force his hand and get him wound up and force him to come in and defend his harem with some challenge bugles, and that's worked really well in the past for me.
Yeah, one of the points that you had on this little outline, Eric, was that, basically, all right, so now you found them. Now what, right? Do you call? How frequent? How often? What style of calling, et cetera? And what Isaiah mentioned earlier, too, like I totally agree with both of you. My favorite time when I do call is typically late morning after things are kind of slowed down. But like you mentioned in the morning, it's really hard to call bulls in the morning, at least herd bulls, because they're hiking somewhere and they're following the cows to get there. And so it's hard to, A, they move fast, B, they already have, sort of a destination in mind, or at least that lead cow does. And so you're just kind of cruising along behind them. And I think a ton of people make that mistake of calling to them constantly. Like I used to do it all the time. I'd get fairly close again, because they're feeding while they move, and I'd get close enough and like, okay, I'm going to set up. He's getting really excited. I'm going to call him in right here. And then I'd call and call and call and call and call. And next thing you know, he's like 600 yards away instead of 150. And then I would hustle up and get up there again. And the whole time, I think the cows and the bull, everybody's shaking their heads like, who is this rookie? Like, why is this person trying to bother us? So, yeah, I think the morning, if you're going to break it down into pieces of the day, I think the morning as a general rule, just keep in mind that even if the elk's moving away from you, I don't think that is a bad sign, but it's bad for you if you overcall at that point, because the basic rule of thumb is their communication structure. If the bull's bugling, maybe even cows are talking back to you a little bit, they're just giving you coordinates on how to get to them. They're not saying, oh, I'm going to reroute my entire morning and we're going to turn around as a herd and come back to you. It's like, no, get your butt up here where where we're at, get in line, and then we'll go to bed together. So I think in the morning, that's why it's so tough to call one in, at least a herd bull.
Yep.
Yeah, I think a big education on that for me was when I started hunting area where I could see elk.
Mm-hmm.
Like growing up, you could never see them. And so you're bugling, wondering what they're doing, what the bull's doing, what the cow's doing. And then you never know. And then I started hunting more open areas where I was like, oh, they're on their feet feeding. Or you bugle and you watch the bull pay no attention to you. And you're like, okay, well, maybe I should resort to something else.
Maybe I should get closer.
Yeah. So that, I mean, yeah, being in an area where you can, I know, early on when I was getting advice from Jerrod and Dan and, both them, they both told me, like, the more time you can spend watching elk, the better off you're going to be. And so I think spending time watching how they act, how they respond, what they're doing during the pre, post, and mid-rut is going to help you out a lot.
And even morning, midday, and evening too, because they're pretty habitual in that regard. They're nomads, but kind of how they approach every day is very similar, in my opinion.
Yep.
I feel like every night they're going to come out somewhere special to feed. In some cases, it might be an alfalfa field that they might hike literally 10 miles to get to every day. That's not an exaggeration. But it also might just be a basin that they all come down into to rut and feed at night. And then in the morning, they're going to hike somewhere to go to bed that they feel pretty secure about. And then, midday, they're going to be up and down off their feet throughout the day. And in the evening, generally speaking, they're going to get up, they're going to make an initial move, and then they're going to stage an annoyingly long period of time, usually in a place where, I call them sentinels. They've got some sort of lookout position where any angle you try to approach these things from is going to be a marginal call. And then right at last light, they start making a big move again. And again, I'm talking mostly about highly pressured public land, type of elk.
I think I've coached you in on a couple of those in the past.
I think you stopped me on one I would have killed too. I know that for a fact.
What happened there?
But yeah. Oh, we'd been on a bull since late morning that day, right? We spotted a pretty good bull. Isaiah had already killed a great bull that year on a really tough area to kill elk, honestly. And because it's super public, super high traffic. And then, we spotted a bull I wanted to kill. And I did the staging game with him for hours that evening. And then finally I was like, man, there's a water trough around here on the backside of this ridge. I know they're going to go get water soon. And Isaiah talked me out of charging it. And then at the last minute he goes, hey, I think you're right. He's like, we should go. And unfortunately I wasn't in the kind of physical fitness that enabled me to get there fast enough. I was about 100 yards short of where I needed to be when they showed up at the water that I wanted to go to. So
that's why when you're hunting with the partner, just go with your gut feeling and not their opinion.
That is a good pro tip, actually. Sometimes two minds are not better than one. But no, I think, like, back to calling, though, as a general rule, no matter what time, and I think the three of us have kind of different styles in the peak of the rut, maybe a gradient of risk tolerance or aggressiveness, I should say. For me, I'm probably the least aggressive on this group, maybe because I'm getting old, out of shape. But, yeah, because once you finally get to elk, right? So I think there's this whole sequence. Every single morning, very rarely does it go exactly like I think. All right, I'm going to set up here, and the elk are going to come by or whatever. It's like, nope, they went out the other side of the basin or the valley. So then I got to make a big, hairy move, and I finally catch up to them at, say, 9:30 in the morning, where I'm back in meaningful distance, where I can pose a threat to somebody besides myself. And at that point, I don't want to relocate the elk and have to go do this again. So I start getting pretty careful once I get in that zone. I've always just used the mantra, get as close as you can for as long as you can, and good things will happen. And the second, and part of being close for a long time, is not letting them know that you're there, right? Not making noise, not getting smelled. And that noise includes a cow call to me. Like, it's almost my last resort at that point, but I don't think necessarily you two feel that way either. And don't get me wrong, I love to call to elk, and I get tempted and I make bad decisions, but as a general rule, I like to just be in their presence, right on their heels as long as I can, and generally speaking, some good things can happen. What do you guys think of that?
Yeah, I think for me, some of it depends on the size of the bull. Some bulls I'm really willing to take more risks. I mean, like, I feel like for me, bigger bulls, I'm a little more careful and almost like I play it too calm.
Yeah.
Where like a bull, I'm like, I'd be happy with him, but it's not necessarily one I'm going to lose sleep over. Those are ones I do a little more like trial and error on to see what I can get away with. But I wouldn't say like I've spent a lot of time around in the elk woods and calling, but I don't know what the elk are doing really. Like I usually call, and depending on the response I get from a bull is usually how I'll play it. Like if he's just like not really into it, then I stop calling and just kind of do the silent approach. But you know, if you're getting a bull pretty wound up, then usually it's fun and you get excited, and then you can kind of start going back and forth. But I've also had that where I'm like, oh man, he's coming in, and then pretty soon it goes quiet and they're 400 yards away, and you're like, what the heck just happened?
And then a mile.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I don't know, then I'll get like really aggressive and try to chase them out of the country because I've had good luck being like where you go into like running after them and just calling to where you finally just annoy the bull and he like decides he's going to turn around and figure out what's going on.
Absolutely. No, I've had really good luck doing that. Well, let me back up. So when I first started trying to figure out all this archery elk hunting stuff, man, I was watching the Primos videos back then, and I'm watching these guys just do these setups and call these big bulls right into their lap, you know. And of course, I think oftentimes, if not all the time, they're hunting private land. They're hunting different elk than I'm hunting.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd go, you know, on general tags, Northwest Montana, and I'd do all that. You know, I'd do all these perfect setups and find the right bench to set up on and make all these pretty sounds. And man, those bulls just didn't come in at the rate I thought they were going to, like I seen on TV, right? So, man, I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed, I guess, but after like 5 or 8 years, it finally started clicking that when I started running at these bulls, literally running at these bulls, that's when things really started to change. And, you know, in my mind anyway, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get these bulls to make a mistake, right? You're trying to get them so fired up that they can't think right. And I'm talking more from a calling strategy standpoint right now. So I kind of liken it to road rage, where you've only got so much time where you're going to make a mistake I don't know if you guys have road rage issues, but early on,
I've been known to.
You're ready to pull over and beat some butt, right? But you get to the next stoplight, maybe a couple minutes later, and you look over at him. You might give him a funny look or whatever, but you're kind of over it. As time goes on, you start to calm down. Well, I think it's the same thing with these elk. I try not to interact with them vocally until I can get close enough to where I can make a run at them and be in their lap within, 3 or 4 minutes. And when you keep that window of communication shorter, I think your odds of a bull getting so fired up initially and making a mistake are dramatically higher.
Yeah, I actually like that analogy. I think that maybe what that has a lot to do with too is that's how elk actually treat each other in the wild, right? That's the one huge mistake that humans make. We lurk.
Yep.
We're creepy. We're like a mountain lion with a cow call. And it's like, pretty soon elk are like, what in the heck is going on? There's something creeping around in the woods. It's not as quiet as it thinks it is. When it's walking, it's brushing, sticks and whatever else, snapping sticks. And then it cow calls at me, and it just does not compute for them. Whereas, like, and again, this goes back to Isaiah and observation, when you watch how elk behave in the wild, if there's a bull approaching a herd, he's excited, and he's storming the castle. Now, he may not run right in and go to fighting, because that's not what bulls do either, but he is going to make his presence known very quickly. Like, hey, guys, I'm over here, and, man, I'm super excited to find some companionship, and he trots in with his tongue hanging out and his eyes rolled back. And the big bull might run him off immediately, and they may never even hit antlers. But to your point, Eric, the protracted, lurking, calling from the shadows approach that so many of us take, and I'm super guilty of it, is not how elk behave in the wild at all.
Right. Right.
And it is funny, like, I don't think I'm doing that, but then I'll be on elk and I'll hear someone else call.
Then you can be judgmental, right?
You're like, what are they doing? And they're probably thinking the same thing. Like, what is that idiot doing over there?
Yep.
But no,
So-
I do think, I mean, even being down here in some of the better units in southern Utah, like these elk act a lot different than Northwest Montana public land elk.
That's
Like
for sure.
I mean, it's just they're easier to call in.
Way easier to call in.
And I don't know. You look at the number of tags they give out for some of these limited entry areas. Granted, you have spike hunts that are happening and cow hunts, but I don't think these big bulls get harassed near as much as they do in some of these other areas.
No, for sure. I would say, when I try to kind of really get cognitive with how I approach calling elk when I do call, I think there's kind of 3 categories I'd put it in. One is that aggressive category, and I hate to admit it, but I have had some really good success doing that at times. I think it's a super high risk move, and again, it's a decent way to relocate elk several miles out of your area, and you have to go find them again, but it can work. The other one is to play like just sort of the hard to get little cow. I don't think it ever works when you're playing a hard to get bull. I don't think if you're bugling around the herd, if you watch young bulls, they cannot help themselves. They're in the edge of the herd the whole time and making themselves seen and heard. So if you're out there lurking around and tooting on your bugle in the shadows, again, that's a big red flag to the whole elk community, in my opinion. But cows do it all the time. There's a lot of cows, younger calves, etc., that are just like, I don't really want to be a part of this nonsense that's going on over there. And so a really coy, timid cow call here or there has worked very well for me when a bull finally just gets fed up and is like, I'm going to go over there and get you. But you can't sit over there and hyper hot and lip ball and everything else in those scenarios right outside in the shadows because, again, it's just not elk behavior. But you can be coy. And then finally, the third one is those rare scenarios where you just call a bull in from a long ways away and hammering away at the call just brings him in on a rope. And there's no rhyme or reason for that. I've had it work on older, mature bulls. I've had it work on babies way more often than older, mature bulls, to be clear. But I think those are the 3 kind of things I try to isolate my strategy into. Like, am I going to be aggressive? And if so, I got to be aggressive. If I'm going to be timid, then I'm just going to be super passive. I might let a cow call out once every 5-10 minutes. I mean, it's excruciating to do it that way, but I've had that work more than any other method if I am calling.
Well, and I think the other advantage to that really sparse calling is that, if you're going 5 or 10 minutes without making a sound, and a bull does decide to come check things out and see what's going on, you're kind of forcing him to work out exactly your location, right? So it's more likely that he's going to wander.
That's when you rip a bugle.
No, that's a good point. That's a really good point. Yeah, they've got you pinpointed better than you ever think they do, but the longer between that last call and his next interaction, the better. And the other thing too is that you tend to hear, their footsteps, hear them moving, huffing, doing little tiny vocalizations way better if you're not constantly thinking about, all right, I'm going to make my next call. I just think people overcall all the time. And I do it too.
And to go along with that, if something's working out, I'm guilty of cow calling, 20 minutes goes by and here comes the bull. And he's getting within 100 yards and now I'm like, it's time to bugle.
So I'm going to send it.
And then things just fall apart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, exactly. I mean, if you've got a bull figured out and you're doing something that's working, why change it? It's easy to overthink these situations, right? I mean, the bottom line is we can have all these talking points and we can give you our best advice on given a certain situation how to, maybe respond or handle it. But man, at the end of the day, I can't think of 2 elk scenarios I've had over decades that are identical. There is some element to new parts of the puzzle in each one of these scenarios that you do have to be quick on your feet and react to a certain new scenario and do your best to figure out what you think the best move is. But man, it's easy to overthink it too, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It is, and I'm gonna challenge that notion of thinking that no two scenarios are the same, because in my mind, almost all of them are the same until you introduce yourself into the equation, and that's probably why I'm as cautious as I am about pulling the call out of my pocket or throwing one in my mouth at this point in time. And it's because prior to me introducing myself to the equation, elk are just trying to survive and propagate the species during the rut. So they're on high alert at all times. Every bull out there is trying to get on a cow. And until we create some nuance to the situation, it's basically they're a social animal, right? Like that time of year, they're super social in weird ways that they never are prior to. So that's where it's consistent until you make yourself introduce yourself, I think. And that's why I'm scared to do it most of the time, where I'm like, right now they're just a herd, and if I'm on the edge of this herd for long enough, there's a good chance that Mr. Herd Bull will wind up in my bow range.
Well, that's a great point.
And I think to go with that, I mean, I've spent a lot of time chasing elk, and I can't remember if it was you or someone that told me, don't get to where the elk are, get to where they're going. And if you can get in front of them with the wind in your favor, you're a lot better off there than playing catch up all day.
It's true.
No, that's a great point too. Yeah, I mean, calling elk into a direction they generally already want to go is a hell of a lot easier than trying to turn them around and do something 180 degrees different than what they had in mind. We
big time.
We killed a bull in the breaks one morning. We glassed up a bull by himself, nice bull that was feeding out in the bottoms, and started climbing up the mountain to go bed for the day. And the thermals hadn't switched yet. And what we ended up doing is we just paralleled that bull, up the next little drainage over until the sun really started warming things up and the wind switched. And as soon as that happened, we got to a place in some timber where we could side hill and get, in that same drainage he was going up. And then we started calling with the wind in our favor and in a direction he already wanted to go. And that bull came in on a rope. I mean, that was the easiest bull we've ever called in. So, yeah, night and day, calling them in a direction they want to go than the other way around.
No, for sure. I love that tip. You mentioned like call selection, Eric, is one of the points, and we've kind of touched on it a little bit. Bugles versus cow calls, and then if cow calls, what types of bugles. And it's interesting. I went to we did a tag presentation at one of the elk shape camps that Dan Staten puts on, and Joel Turner, who runs the Shot IQ program, has like a really dialed in like dialect that, if they do this, this means this, etc. And I'm not questioning that, because he honestly has been a part of a culling program in the state of Washington, and he's probably killed more elk than I'll ever see.
And he sounds like an elk.
He does. He's an excellent caller, right? Very, very good caller. But my point is that I think sometimes we do overanalyze exactly what the calls mean necessarily. You're always worried, well, okay, did he like that or not? Why did he just all of a sudden not answer that one, but he answered the last three? And again, I think it's more important to just realize that you're part of a community, or you're trying to be part of a community if you are calling. And you don't want to be that belligerent drunk guy at the bar that everybody hates, that barrels in and starts waving a wad of cash around and being obnoxious and ordering drinks. And I think way too often as humans, that's who we are when we introduce ourselves to the elk herd. It's like, oh, here's another obnoxious guy at the bar. And so it's more like, hey, it's a social structure. Communication does mean something. If nothing more than just kind of staying in touch with each other. Like, all right, hey, I hear a cow down there. I'm going to bugle. I'm talking from the bull's point of view, because I want her to come up here. I want her to know that I'm here and this is where all the ladies are. And again, I think we overanalyze it. We overcommunicate. We just become obnoxious.
All right. So what do you guys think? How differently would you hunt a lone bull versus a herd bull? You got any different ways of going about that scenario?
Man, I can't think of a ton of times where I've hunted just lone bulls. I mean, usually there's, early season, there's a couple basins I like where you might have a few bulls hanging out in it together where, again, you kind of do the let's figure out where they're going and get ahead of them. If they're feeding across, heading for some timber, where they're moving fairly slow. They don't got cows around to, keep them super active. So for lone bulls like that, again, I kind of like the visual approach, getting in on them just because they're not going to be vocal, at least during the rut and a frenzy where there's elk around. Even if the bull's not bugling, you can hear cows and whatnot. So I would say for me, it's more of a visual hunt on a lone bull than trying to call them in.
Yeah, I think that's true. I'll touch on that, but I'm going to go with the herd bull scenario first. And I sound like I'm beating a dead horse, but there is virtually no incentive for a herd bull to come to your calls. He's leaving cows unattended when he walks away from the herd, and there's almost always some sort of subordinate bull around there that wants to hop on his cow the second he's gone. Pop on a cow, as your boy would say.
Yeah.
Gonna go pop on a cow. So if he turns his back on the herd, he's got immediate competition for his genetic code, trying to mount every cow in his herd. If he's coming to a bull call, he doesn't really want to fight. He wants to breed. I mean, at the end of the day, that's all that bull wants to do. So I think as it relates to herd bulls, the notion of calling them in, you have to be really careful about it. And like you were saying earlier, you might be able to interfere with the edge of his herd. And then he does have incentive to come over, assert dominance, demonstrate to the cows that he's the right bull for them, and maybe blow you out of there and unfortunately catch an arrow in his lungs. But outside of that, from a distance, there's almost no incentive to try to call to a herd bull, in my opinion. If you almost need to be in bow range, in my opinion, before you start trying to communicate with a herd bull. Otherwise, there's nothing positive in him going for a hike blind, looking for an elk he can't see that's far enough away that he's got to leave the herd.
No, I even think that bull we killed, we knew he was in that canyon. We just didn't know where.
Mm-hmm.
And from before daylight, I bugled a half a dozen times as we were working our way up the draw, and cow called, and he never once made a peep. And he was there the whole time, But he had no desire to give away his location, to come check us out. We ended up walking up on him in his bed and killing him, but it was just like he could have cared less. He wasn't giving up where he was with his 4 ladies hanging out.
And that was a giant, old, mature bull.
Yeah.
Yep. And then back to lone bulls, for me, I agree with Isaiah. I mean, assuming the fact that we're saying lone bull means I've probably seen him, right? And I've identified, hey, he's all by himself. My son killed one with me. His first bull that he killed was, granted, it was like a 3.5-year-old bull. It wasn't an old ancient warrior, but this bull was alone, coming down off of a ridge from the Idaho side, feeding down into Montana where our tag was. And we saw him from several miles away. I had hunted that ridge system before, told my son where we wanted to be, and we went as hard as we could. Well, as hard as I could. I think my son could have went a little harder than me for sure. But we got to the little bench, and we caught him coming over the top. He started making a little rub, and again, he was all by himself. And I just told my son, I said, you're on your own. I said, slip your boots off, get as close as you can, and see what happens. And he ended up putting a great shot on the bull and killed him. But, again, assuming that you can see and identify that it's a lone bull, I'm more likely to call to a lone bull than I am to a herd bull because, especially, again, if I can see him, I'll have one eye in the spotting scope and I'll blow my bugle and see what he does, right? And if he's completely careless, like doesn't even lift a head or whatever, I'm like, I probably ought to throw that thing in my backpack because I don't think that's going to do a lot. And same thing for cow calls, etc. So a lot of times I'll test them visually and see what their reaction is. And if I get a good positive reaction out of one, then I might continue to use that sparingly, or again, just try to figure out where he's going and try to get in front of him with the wind right. What about you, Eric?
Yeah, I mean, for those lone bulls, I'll typically start out, and I'm one of those guys too. I'm guilty of calling too much. I can't help myself. I mean, I think
it's fun.
It is. I think a lot. I
Yes.
probably have killed more elk over the years if I'd just sat back and analyzed the situation a little bit more. But man, I'll give up 10, 20, 30 inches calling in a bull than trying to intercept them. I just love that communication with the elk. So typically, I'm going to pull out a call, and I'll start with a cow call on a lone bull. I mean, he's no different than a herd bull. He's got one thing on his mind that he wants, and if he can get that thing without having to fight, an adversary for it, I think that they're going to come in a lot less wary and a little bit quicker. So yeah, I'll typically start out with a cow call and judge his reaction and see if that's working. If not, then typically a lone bull isn't going to be the biggest bull on the mountain. So then I'll throw a more passive, 2 or 3 note, almost locator type bugle at him, and give him the impression that whatever bull's over there is a bull that he can fight
Spike
and take care of business on. So yeah, that's typically my strategy with a lone bull. And to your point,
Yeah.
With a herd bull, if there's one thing I've learned over all these years, you're not calling a herd bull in, more than 50 or 100 yards off of his cows. He's got everything he needs. If you're going to kill a herd bull, either you're going to need to get close and wait for something good to happen, like you say, or you're going to need to challenge him and force the hand and make him show off to his ladies and come into you.
Yep. Nope, totally agree. One of the other things that we were going to talk about is moon phase. We get that question quite a bit, right?
Yep.
And honestly, I've been fortunate that I get to hunt multiple states most years during September and early October, mid-October. So I just don't care. I plan my hunts around windows of time that I have, and I just go hunt what the cards I'm dealt, whether it be hot temperatures, full moons, you name it. But if you don't have that luxury, I can understand why it's a real concern, and I think it's a huge concern for Midwest and Eastern, Southern whitetail hunters, because it can really dictate the outcome of their hunts. But elk are, it's a totally different, it's a big social animal. I don't really worry about hunting the full moon. In fact, I kind of like it. If I've got a full moon, I'll just kind of get more nocturnal, not less. And I've been known to ghost around with elk at 3 a.m. in the morning and kind of hang out in the downwind side of them for several hours before shooting light. So I don't know. I mean, I don't like it. I do think that it can definitely, especially when temperatures are hot and pressure is high, public land pressure is high, it definitely makes elk want to do more business at night. But I've never seen elk not still do some activity during the day. But I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I kind of agree. I just think your window in the morning is a little shorter on how vocal they're going to be. I mean, yeah, I'm kind of with you on that. I just kind of hunt when I can and where I can. So if it's a full moon, it's a full moon. And I feel like you can get away with a lot during the full moon, like getting into position
At night?
Yeah, where you can actually kind of see where you're going.
I agree.
And for whatever reason, unless those elk get a good whiff of you, like sometimes they could really care less that you're there, and then you surprise them right when it gets light.
Well, I happen to have a pretty strong feeling about this. And this does not pertain to, rifle hunting outside of the rut. Clearly, they're going to be more nocturnal during a full moon. And your windows in the morning, like Isaiah says, are going to be shorter. It does seem like they get up a little earlier in the evenings from my experience, but coming strictly from a rut activity standpoint with the full moon, and I'm going to geek out on you here for a minute, but when I was trying to figure this whole game out a long time ago, I used to document every single elk encounter I had. And we're talking like temperature, time of day, what the weather was doing, the elevation I was at, the elevation the bull responded from, all kinds of stuff. And one of the things I documented was...
Hold on a second. What kind of backpack did you have to pack that abacus around in? You were go ahead.
I just take some notes after every hunt, and one of the things I documented was what part of the moon phase this went down in. And granted, this is over the course of a decade worth of hunting and various moon phases through multiple Septembers, but when I started compiling all that data and really trying to glean any information off of it I could, I started noticing some commonalities between elevations that seemed to be a little bit better where I was hunting, and bluebird clear morning days seemed to be a little bit better as well. But the thing that really jumped out at me was how much more activity I was getting on a full moon phase or around a full moon phase. And what I ended up coming up with was that 70% of the vocal encounters I had were between 2 days prior to the full moon through 6 days post full moon. So in other words, 70% of my encounters were in that 1/3 of the moon phase. Conversely, only 14% of those my encounters were in the 1/3 of the moon phase centered around that new moon. So I am fully convinced that, there's some wives' tales about how full moons affect humans as well, right? As far as childbirth numbers and, emergency room visits and all that type of stuff. I'm buying that. And I think the elk are affected by the full moon, and they just can't help but crank it up, when the full moon's going on, and are a lot more vocal and, more wound up and likely to make a mistake as well.
I don't think I would say anything that wouldn't support that. That's part of the reason why I've always enjoyed hunting full moons, but I didn't carry my abacus and my briefcase around. But just thinking back through the number of nights I've crept around under a full moon and it turned into a blood trail at some point in time, in the next 24 hours, the full moon has always been good to me. So, yeah, that's interesting. I kind of thought you were going to have just the opposite data, but again, we're not hunting a whitetail that, doesn't make – you can hear them from 2 miles away, you know what I mean?
Right.
So you're not hunting an animal that is totally equipped like a whitetail. So good food for thought.
Yeah, no, I'm glad there's people like you out there taking that time to note those things, because I'm just like, it is what it is. Let's go.
Killing elk, yeah. All right, how about some back pocket tricks to use during the rut? Do you guys have any tricks that you would implement more peak rut stuff than pre or post that have worked out well for you?
Well, one thing we didn't talk about while we were talking about calling, is raking. And honestly, if you watch how elk interact with each other, it always turns into a raking contest before it turns into an antler clacking contest, like always. Again, this comes back to having the opportunity to watch a lot of elk. A satellite bull is constantly around the herd, rubbing his antlers and bugling and trying to act tough. Even two big bulls that are about to square off, it seems like they always end up wrapped around a tree before they wrap around each other. So raking, I think, is a really kind of that last little convincing thing you can do. I hate it when I'm calling, raking, and solo, because I can't hear anything. I can't hear him coming when he finally commits, and I'm over there scratching on a tree, and you got your bow in one hand and your call hanging out of your mouth, and all of a sudden he's in bow range, and you're like, oh, whoops. But if you're partner calling, I think that's a really good trick, personally. I think it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, and sticking with that raking
I mean, for
thing,
me,
that's another trick that you can implement as well. When those bulls are raking, that is an awesome time to close a gap, because they're beating the heck out of a tree. They've got their eyes closed for 10 or 15 seconds at a time. They can't hear what's going on. If you can get, quarter back or straight behind them, you can literally run at those elk for 10 or 15 seconds and make up a whole bunch of ground. And then, they'll typically stop that raking, and you obviously want to quit your progress as soon as that happens. And they'll look around, maybe throw out a bugle, and a couple minutes later, jump back into it. And they might do that for half an hour. I mean, that's a lot of sequences where you can close a gap.
Yep.
Yeah, I had some buddies hunting with me a couple of years ago, and it was right towards dark, and two bulls started fighting. And we had 150 yards to go across this open flat, totally exposed. And we walked up to 30 yards of those bulls, and then they ended up rattling closer to us, and we shot one and missed one. But, I was like, holy crap, are we really going to get away with this? But they were so focused on beating each other up that they had no clue what was about to go down.
So.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I think they're super audio oriented, right? Like they're very vocal. They hear brush being raked, so raking, rattling, honestly. And again, it's not for a solo hunt, but having somebody with a couple of rattling antlers that can clack together. So raking, rattling, and even like showing elk a decoy or an antler, pieces that they recognize immediately as parts of an elk can be big game changers. It's just super hard to do solo, which is how I hunt most of the time. And
Now
so
that you're over 50, are you going to?
I hope so. Are you going to start wandering around with? I need you to carry like a life-size decoy, 3D preferably, a full set of 330 bullsheds to clack around. But no, those things I think are more like I don't have any like, oh, make this call at this time of year and you're going to get ran over by an elk. I don't have any of those kind of secrets, honestly, because like we've all talked, every scenario is a little different in that regard. But those nuanced, decoy-esque sort of activities can make a big difference.
Yeah, one of my favorite things to do, and it typically works better in an area, but early morning when those elk are moving, like I feel like if I can get under them and then just in front of them, you're going to have, because you can kind of, that bull, from my experience, he's going to bugle every 30 seconds or a minute as the cows are moving. He's following up the rear. He's making a little noise. So instead of thinking, okay, I'm going to set up and call, again, just making, it's kind of a full send, like, okay, I've been here before. I know where they're going. I'm going to, stay underneath them, get into position to where hopefully they just funnel right through you on a trail and you're right there to execute a shot. So
the saddle's a really good place to do that too, where they transition from one side of a ridge to another. The wind is going to be blowing off of both sides, it's opposite directions. If you have a normal morning with cool the falling cool air. But yeah, that's a really good point. I call that the last stand move. And I do try to execute that every morning when elk are moving. I try to think, all right, where are they headed to, and where is my last stand going to be? And it might be out in the wide open sagebrush. I might be hunkered behind the tallest sagebrush in the saddle, just knowing that that's where the wind's going to transition and I'm going to have my best opportunity. And if you screw it up and they get downwind of you, then of course you blow it up for 2 miles. Or if you screw it up and they walk by you at 120 yards, you just sit there harmlessly hunkered down in a sagebrush wishing you had picked differently.
Yep.
No, that's why I say for me, that's typically worked better in an area that I've seen the elk do that before instead of a brand new spot where you're like, oh, I'm going to go here. Sure. And then they end up 400 yards the other way. You're like, dang it. So.
That's very true. Good point.
Yep.
What about you, Eric? Any back pocket tricks? Inflatable cow elk decoys?
Yeah, I played around with the cow elk decoys. Those can work for sure, especially on more call shy bulls, in general units and stuff that have heard every call under the sun and have associated a lot of that calling with humans. Like you say, just give them a flash of something that looks like elk is oftentimes enough to get them to do what you're hoping they're going to do. But no, I'd say
at least calm them down where they'll check off of you.
Right. Yeah. But no, I'd say probably one of my favorites is a calling one. I mean, how many times I've gotten a bull going and gotten within, 100 yards of him and he's all fired up and it sounds like he's coming in, but there you are 20 minutes later and nothing's changed. You're trying to do something to make him flip his switch and lose his stuff and make a mistake. Most of the time, not most of the time, but almost most of the time, when you interrupt a bugle, when they're all fired up and he lets out a bugle and you cut him off, those bulls will be in your lap in a second. I've had bulls you can make all the pretty calls in the world, but until you interrupt that one last call, that's what flips the switch and has worked really well for us in the past.
I would agree with that. If I'm getting aggressive with a bugle, I like to cut him off. When we're getting close, I like to cut him off. It does really anger him.
Yeah, cut him off and then mimic exactly what he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
Like if he just bugles and then he ramps it up and more like almost barks at you bugles, and I'll do that back. And then if he chuckles, I chuckle. Like, yeah, if you can match their intensity with more intensity.
Mm-hmm. Meet my intensity.
It seems like you can definitely push them over the edge.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yeah, and, going back to what we were talking about earlier, what type of call to make when, if you're ever in doubt, I think that's a great fallback. Do I cow call? Do I bugle? Man, mimic what he's doing.
Mimic what he's doing and then shoot straight or over their back.
Keep your nerves together.
And put a good shot. Yeah.
Now, that is one of the harder things about calling elk in, especially by yourself, is knowing when to move and where to move during that sequence.
Big time.
Because a lot of times I've been on the move closer while the bull's on the move closer, and then you wind up in a stare down that results in them running away. So, yeah, having a partner calling is the way to go.
Absolutely. Awesome, guys. Well, anything else?
I don't think so. Have fun. Remember, herd bulls have no incentive to come hiking through the woods trying to find a mysterious cow call coming from someone who's slinking around like a mountain lion. That's my final pro tip.
That's right. Yep. All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening to another Built to Hunt podcast, and best of luck out there this fall.